I think we're on. Okay, I think we're live. That was okay. Everybody, I was. This is so bizarre. Maybe it's my guest because my guest today they are trying to silence and cancel him. I have never experienced this on StreamYard before, where I have tried to go live and I've been told that traffic is unexpectedly high. Anyway, we're on, I think, and we will be right back after our usual introduction here. Thanks for your patience.
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
Your home is your castle. We're calling on the government to introduce and immediately pass the Stand on Guard law.
But we also need to resolve to resist.
Okay. We'll do it live. Okay. No. We'll do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
And when you do it live, sometimes things don't work out exactly as planned. Thanks for your patience, everybody. I know you're saying, what happened to Krayden? He's gone. Anyway, I want to bring on my guest, Jim McMurtry, right now. Jim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Wonderful to be with you, David.
And it is a real pleasure. I've been following your story for quite some time, and I got a lot of questions for you, and I think we've got a lot to talk about. But I just wanted to show probably most, if not all, of the video that you posted on YouTube, because I think it's excellent, and I think it's a good starting point. If there's anybody out there in my audience that doesn't know your story, I find it hard to believe there would be, but let's have a listen to it.
Hi, I'm Jim McMurtry. I'm that teacher who was walked out of classroom and career almost 3 years ago for telling the truth about what happened with the discovery of 215 child remains in Kamloops.
There's a developing story out of British Columbia. A First Nation says the remains of more than 200 children have been located, buried on the site of a former residential school. In fact, the largest residential school in the entire national network from the time.
3 years ago, I was in the classroom and students were talking about Christian teachers murdering 215 children at one residential school in Kamloops and elsewhere. I said the wrong thing. Within a half hour, I was led out of classroom and career. So that was 3 years ago. I just would love viewers and for others, starting with you, to appreciate how humiliating it is for a teacher at the end of one's career to be let out in front of one's students. All I said was that it's my understanding that those children who died while in attendance at residential school did so from disease, sometimes accidents and fires, but mostly disease such as tuberculosis. There haven't been any graves found. I think most people know that now.
And to this day, they're saying there's the number keeps inflating, but there's tens of thousands of missing and murdered, Indigenous children in Canada. They haven't found a single case of a missing child, a single case of a murdered child in any schools. And, teachers generally don't murder their children. It's not good for one's reputation.
I think the most important thing is to be informed and to present the material that one has, and ideally establish facts to students, to see those facts from a number of different perspectives. I think that a teacher's responsibility is to present his historical content as fairly as possible from a variety of perspectives and leave children to make up their own minds, to come to their own conclusions. And so I'm hopefully going to win in some way, at least win vindication. And I'm very appreciative of all those who have supported me, and I'm hoping that I can be an influence in other teachers to just say no, that you're not going to fold, you're not going to go back on your principles. The other side is wrong. It's absolutely appalling that we're indoctrinating children not just with Indigenous issues, but with race and gender, and with censorship of literature, with falsification of history, lowering academic standards, and so forth. I think it's time that teachers just say, we've had enough. We're not going to wander any further from the core academic values that have guided us until this time. Thank you.
That's a very powerful video, Jim. And if you haven't seen it, folks, share that video and share what Jim says every day on his X site. You know what infuriated me about your story, Jim, and I'm certainly somebody who has been trying to get the truth out as well about this mass grave hoax, not only in Kamloops but across Canada. But you were not just fired; you were humiliated in front of your class, as you mentioned in that video. You were then canceled. Nobody even acknowledges you even worked there. It's incredible to me. And what did you do? You exposed the hoax. You told the truth. And that to me is indicative, it's emblematic of how our Canadian society punishes truth tellers. And anybody who doesn't abide by the woke narrative espoused by, in BC, the most left wing government in Canada, and in Ottawa, by the Carneyite government that is working against free speech just as hard as Justin Trudeau ever did. So that's a long preamble, but I want to ask you, first of all, how did it feel to be in Abbotsford? And Abbotsford is supposedly the most Christian city in Canada. And I used to work for the former MP from Abbotsford, Ed Fast. My mother was in Mission. My sister was in Chilliwack. I know Abbotsford very well. More churches per capita than any other city in Canada. Right in the heart of Canada's Bible Belt, which stretches, roughly from there to Calgary. And I'm thinking, this can happen in Abbotsford. It's amazing to me. Did it shock you at the time, and does that still shock you that they could do this to you?
Absolutely. And first of all, I'd like to say, David, that you've inspired me for a lot of years. Abbotsford, I was a little bit worried as a teacher because there is some fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, that I might not be in accord with. When I began my teaching career, 45 years ago, it was a problem teaching evolution in some schools. Anyhow, I had that in the back of my mind. And then I go into Abbotsford and I realized that my only friends were the Christian churches, the Christian students in my classroom. To everybody else, I was the enemy because I was, as you can see, an old white guy. And it was just made absolutely no sense to me at all. That I was expected to routinely criticize that community, which is the backbone of Abbotsford, and obviously the Mennonites in particular, who established the community. But these are the good folk in Abbotsford are not at all woke. So how is it, as you said, that the whole community gets captured by these woke lunatics, cultists? And the same thing happened next door in Chilliwack, where you have a longstanding trustee named Barry Neufeld, who ended up being beaten up. And as you know, recently he was assigned an award penalty of almost $750,000, which it has to be paid to Chilliwack teachers who identify as being something different sexually than you or me. And so how does that happen? I just in Abbotsford and Chilliwack and all sorts of places across the country where parents, and particularly parents, fall asleep when teachers and administrators in schools are pushing kids to think they're in the wrong body, to think that their race, the color of their skin is going to define their lives, to think that we should replace Western culture with indigenous hunter-gatherer ways of knowing. So no, I don't have an answer other than it surprised me as well.
Well, I'm sure it did, but a couple of weeks back, I found it absolutely incredible that at the First Nations conference in Ottawa, one of the First Nations chiefs, and I should have reminded myself of his name, but he was asked about the the hoax. But of course, the media didn't call it a hoax. They just said, "Well, do you still plan to do some excavation in Kamloops to see if there are any mass graves to confirm the mass?" He said, "We don't need to do that. We don't need to do that because we're in communication with the dead spirits of these children that are there, and they're crying out to us." And I'm thinking, if anybody else had have suggested they don't need to do something to prove their case because they're engaged in necromancy and spiritualism with the spirits of the supposed dead children that we know aren't buried there. This is plumbing. These are not bodies buried in this mass grave. They consumed all the money that they were given to do their excavation, to do their study, do their research. It's all gone. Not a blade of grass has been moved. Not an inch of topsoil has been removed, and yet they continue to suggest that there's mass graves there. And why do you think the mainstream media is continuing to let them get away with this?
Yeah, and the mainstream media is obviously a guilty party here. But let's remember, over almost 5.5 years ago, when I was walked out in front of my students, as you remember, everybody was against me, David, and not you. I mean, everybody, the whole educational establishment. There wasn't a teacher, an administrator, a trustee, a minister of education, anywhere. Nobody in Canada, nobody in the Christian church, nobody in any institution in Canada who came to me and said, "Oh, Jim, I'm going to support you on this notion of yours," which at the time was considered to be quite evil, that they're lying, that Indigenous elders are lying about all these murdered children. Just at one school, and Murray Sinclair, who was decorated with an Order of Canada, said it could be as many as 25,000 or more missing and disappeared children. That's what I was up against. I like you, I was saying there wasn't anything, there never was anything. And I know that because it's something I studied. There are only 2 kids that ever died at that school. And they died from accidents, Adrian George and Pearl Joe. And the latter one died because she drowned in the river. And they built that big famous pool in front of the school because they didn't want any other kids dying. This was nothing to do with school. It wasn't its fault at all, but it did everything in its power to try and save lives. That's what residential schools were, and particularly in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. They were less schools than child care services. As you know, in Manitoba today, 90% of the children who are in foster care are from the small percent of the population in the province that are Indigenous. So residential schools were for orphans, for kids who didn't have the necessities of life, for kids that were being sexually or physically abused in their home or community. And so the whole thing is completely upside down. And I posted just today, David, that there are still residential schools. There are lots of residential schools in Canada because kids living in outlying areas of Canada, particularly the Arctic, they if they're a band of 50 people and they're nomadic, we can't build a school for them right there. So a number, particularly in the Yukon, which I'm writing about, are shipped to this one residential school in Whitehorse. And it's the same thing. They're far away from family, and there's a risk of cultural genocide or whatever because they're living within an English-speaking population. But of course, it's not genocide. It's cultural enhancement. It's an education. It's for kids learning how to, having a chance to make it in this world. So the whole, everything said about residential schools from the very beginning is being false, not just Kamloops, but that's the most egregious example. And so I lost my livelihood for a long time now because I was prepared to say, or not so much that, not prepared to take any courageous stand. That really wasn't in my thinking. It was that I couldn't, as a teacher, lie to kids. That was just something I couldn't do.
Oh, well, absolutely. And before I forget, because I'm terrible at doing this, I want to remind people that you have a book out. And you can get this book through Amazon. We'll have the information in the description, but it's pretty easy. If I could find the book this morning on Amazon, you can too. And I encourage you to buy this book. It's called The Scarlet Lesson, Very interesting, of course, allusion to the Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and 100% behind this. I am getting a copy myself. I want to read it, and I'm going to, as much as possible, promote this book because I think people need to read it, and I think your case is incredibly important to freedom in this country. But not only that, to the future, not only of BC but Canada. I don't know how BC is going to survive as a province if the policies of this new democratic socialist coalition government with the indigenous chiefs is allowed to be sustained. Because I think Aboriginal title, combined with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, is strangling not just the economy of this province, because nothing can be done without consultation approval of the chiefs. But private property rights are essentially null and void now. I know there are people who say, "Well, that's an exaggeration, Dave. It's not really that bad. Don't use hyperbole because property rights still exist in BC." And I say, no, they don't, any more than free speech exists in Canada anymore. And I'm wondering, do you think there's time to nullify the UN DRIP, UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, and Aboriginal title, to restore private property rights to the people of British Columbia before the province disappears and is taken over by a small minority of the population who somehow think they're better and more and special, and they should have better and special real estate rights that other Canadians don't? Is there time to reverse this process before people just leave BC, the emigration becomes unsustainable, and before this spreads to other provinces? Because as you pointed out yesterday, there's over half of Ontario is claimed by one First Nations band. So this isn't just about BC anymore. I think this is about the entire country. But can we reverse the damage here?
David, you said a lot like me. I said a lot like you. And just before I answer, if I could just briefly mention to your viewers that my case is now in front of the Supreme Court of British Columbia, and in the form of through judicial review, in the form of a petition. So my case does have legs, and what I'm arguing for is teachers' right to professional, just basic rights to be able to speak without being afraid. To talking about that I didn't say anything wrong about what happened in Kamloops, and then there's the technicality as well, which if you wanted to I could get into. But the essential thing is what you just said. It's about we have charter rights, and they're meant to be more than a paper tiger. Maybe the most fundamental at all, or the two most fundamental, the ones you've mentioned. Freedom of expression, which is again part of my case, so I'm hoping that I can get a precedent. Win or lose, I'm going to be bringing attention, and I think my case is going to be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court if I lose the provincial level by the group of lawyers with the Justice Center of Constitutional Freedom who have kindly taken on my case. So I stand for freedom, and I also stand for private property rights and public and right to public property, to parks. There's a couple of dozen, and I will answer your question. There's a couple of dozen bands, and which call them nations is a stretch. One of the nations is closest to me. It's called the Quaket, or the New Westminster Indian Band. They have 24 members. They don't have a reserve. There's just 24 people, all part of one extended family, and they're a First Nation. And to give them indigenous title, the whole thing is really quite absurd. But it's close to me. But 24 bands in the province, who, if you go onto their territory, you have to pay a visa. You have to essentially purchase a visa. You have to pay money to be on their territory. And this idea that, this is going to, settle everything in Canada and everything's going to go great for business and so forth. Well, it's important to note that most Indigenous groups in Canada, their end goal is not to have senior title to our private property and to our public property, to our parks and our roads and everything. But it's ultimately to secede from Canada. They want to. They really want to. We put this nonsensical idea of they are a nation in their heads, and now they want to be a nation. The Haida and Haida Gwaii, or Queen Charlotte Islands, they want to be a separate country. And then, of course, in no time, because they won't be able to function, the Chinese will come in, and then we'll have Chinese nuclear submarines right beside our coast. The whole thing is absolutely insane. What can be done? I don't know. Some people think it's late in the game. I think the very first thing, and this is going to sound a little bit extreme, I think the police and CSIS and all those that are involved in enforcement of our laws should arrest David Eby. I really think the MDP government is doing something that is utterly seditious and treasonous. That they're disassembling Canada. So to me, if you were to go around my neighborhood and say that the Russians are coming, and they're going to take all our houses and do terrible things to our women, and that will be the end of us, then people would pick up arms or whatever and say over my dead body and good luck to the Russians. But there's something is more insidious is happening. Is the same thing is happening right where I live. Half the area has already been given over to one First Nation called the Tsawwassen. I live close to Richmond, where a good part of the city has been given over in the first instance to the Cowichan, but that's just one band. They're going to be the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsawwassen, and the Semiahmoo. All these other bands are going to lay claim to Richmond as well. So there is an enemy at our door, and it's an internal enemy, and they're not really to blame, because it's just these absolutely insane woke liberals who think through virtue signaling they're going to somehow preserve better all their power and privileges and fat salaries by going, oh, let's do more for this one small mixed race in the province or in the country. I think they're the biggest national threat in our history. And I have lived through the FLQ crisis in 1970. I've lived through, well, even now with Alberta separation being a real thing. And of course, going way back in time, the disputes between Catholics and Protestants, nothing matches this. There's no greater threat to Canadians than what's happening in all the land and power and special rights being given over to the Indigenous.
Absolutely, 100% with you. And so are a lot of the comments I'm seeing where people saying, let's fight back, take David Eby to court, charge David Eby for what he's doing, because he's essentially disenfranchised the people who live from British Columbia. That's absolutely what he's done here. And I remember, Jim, when I was in university, my journalism professor, who was actually an assignment editor at CBC, he was mentioning, and I forget the context, but he was mentioning that, in BC, 110% of the land is claimed. 110% of the land is claimed by native bands. And he said, that's a ticking time bomb. And that's the first time I really began to think about where this was going. And from that point forth, I started to question the whole reserve system. And I wrote about it. I had numerous columns in the Ottawa Sun back when I used to write for Canadian News as much as I wrote for American. And I said, the reserve system is essentially apartheid. It started as apartheid and it continues as apartheid. But the natives have found a way to exploit it for their own benefit. And the chiefs love it. But the average Indigenous person, I've had Dallas Brody, leader of the One BC Party, on my show several times, and we have both said this. It's the average Aboriginal person in BC is not benefiting from the reserve system. They get nothing out of it except increased poverty, increased addiction, increased joblessness. The chiefs, meanwhile, are becoming millionaires off of this. And I noted something you put on your X the other day. Why are so many of these chiefs not even of native descent? They're basically of European or white people descent, if we can still use that phrase. How is this being allowed? I mean, how are these people becoming chiefs and exploiting the system?
Yeah, and just as a personal note, that I lost my 19-year-old nephew to fentanyl, and fentanyl is the number one killer of Indigenous people in Canada today. So, yes, I would say whatever we want to refer to the the reserve system as, it is above all a killing field of young Indigenous people. It's horrible, and particularly in these remote, isolated communities where there's drugs, alcohol, um, suicide, and tremendous problem with sexual abuse, incest, just unemployment, hopelessness. It's just not. It's an experiment that hasn't worked well for almost everybody. And the Chiefs made all sorts of money, and they don't have to report it. They're the head of the most powerful Indian or indigenous grouping in British Columbia, called the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs. His name is Stuart Phillip, but he made $900,000 tax free in 2014. So you can only imagine what he's making in 2026, and we have no idea. There are a ton of Indigenous people that don't have any or have almost no Indigenous ancestry. So Chief John Thunder, in the Lake of the Woods area of Manitoba, his children, none of them have. His wife, she's Indigenous, and she's blonde-haired European woman. Like, how does that happen? Now, so it's what people are just not prepared to ask questions. They have this idea, oh, we committed an original sin and we must atone forever and ever. Our poor Indigenous people, and the Indigenous people look at it very differently. They're going, these people who are paying us all this money are pretty stupid, and let's just try and get as much as we can from them. And I don't think that helps them long term, because they're not knowing how to live. They're not knowing how to work, how to reproduce their lives. They're not teaching their children the right values. If their children are sitting in their reserves and sniffing glue or paint or something, how is that something that is a good thing? How is turning over foster care, for example, in Manitoba, where I said almost every child in foster care is Indigenous, how is giving them a ton of money into the future and saying, here, you take care of foster care? Well, they're the problem. They haven't shown an ability to raise their children as well as other cultural communities in Canada. So what are we doing? Why in schools are we telling kids that Indigenous knowing is better than science? And we're instead of teaching kids how to read and write and, multiply, we're teaching them how to make a bone fish hook. None of it makes any sense to me. And I think ultimately it's a disservice to Indigenous people.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's a disservice. You recently commented on the Indian Act, which I think Jean Chrétien, when he was Indian Affairs Minister during the early years of the Pierre Trudeau government, he had a chance to scrap the Indian Act. And I understand from people I've talked to over the years, he actually thought it might be not a bad idea. He considered it, but thought the political ramifications might be just too extreme. So they decided to walk away from that. And of course, ever since then, there have been literally hundreds of billions of dollars poured into native reserves, which have not benefited the average Aboriginal person anywhere in Canada. We have now, of course, we continue down this path where land is being expropriated, stolen by these chiefs, and it's not getting any better. Do you think there's still a political possibility of scrapping the Indian Act and getting back to a Canada, or perhaps even just creating a Canada, if it ever was so, that we're all equal under the law? That's an extreme concept to a lot of liberals, but I don't see anything wrong with it. It's all about racial equality, ethnic. We're all equal under the law, no matter who we are, what we think, or where we came from. But I know you'll never hear that from an Aboriginal chief who insists that they're different, they're special, they have special status, special rights. But I was very, shall we say, pleased to hear Premier Daniel Smith recently saying perhaps Section 32 of the Constitution should be reopened, and we should be looking at Aboriginal rights in terms of, are these still relevant? Are these rights still relevant as they're addressed in the Constitution? And as far as I'm concerned, I look at this, I don't see any other alternative except for reopening this question. And if we don't have to reopen the Constitution, because I know there's a reluctance to do that in Canada. It's like the United States has amended theirs 32 times, but we can't even consider amending ours. But I do think the Indian Act has to be repealed. But before that, we need to repeal UN DRIP in BC and Aboriginal title. Do you think there's time to do that if the government changes? I do believe there's the political will from Carolyn Findlay to do that if she becomes the next premier. I know there's the political will from Dallas Brody to do that. I'm pretty sure there's the same political will from Carolyn Findlay. But what worries me is that we're not looking at another BC election for another year. And can the province survive that long?
Yeah, or 2 years. But no, it's a really good question. I'm more cynical than you, David. So maybe that's the only thing that makes us different. I really believe that there is a political will among not just Dallas Brody, but others. Dallas is by far the most fearless and important politician in Canada today, I think. But is there a political will? Absolutely not, with the exception of Dallas and maybe a few others, maybe Miss Finlay, maybe others that are yet to be elected. But that's not going to change Canada. We can't rely on our leaders. Our leaders in Canada are the ones who have prospered from this. That people like Carney, my gosh, he's even renounced the ideas of his own father. He's like Parsons' children in 1984 who turned on their own father to be killed just because they're so caught up in this mania. I think the only way you're going to change Canada for the better, and not just with regard to this issue of Indigenous rights. They're not rights. They're just absurd privileges given based on something that should have been outlawed long ago, which is racial preferences. And but I believe in something else. I believe that there is political will, but it's never going to come from politicians en masse. I think that people have to stop looking at leaders. It's like the school system. You're never going to see and end anything positive in the school system unless the people inside the system revolt, rise up. And I can give you a classic example of how that worked. So in 2024, I went from parking lot to parking lot around Surrey, telling parents that there were drag queens performing in the high school in Surrey, and whether it was Guildford Park or Ellie Matheson or Fraser Heights and others, I'd say that. And all of a sudden it was gone. Parents just didn't know. People just didn't know that in schools across Canada, they were bringing drag queens in to try and convert, proselytize, and get aroused with little children on their laps. And I would say that's the same thing with indigenization and all this Indigenous title and so forth. Just people need to know. And the politicians, they're not going to lead. Politicians, just generally, not talking about a wonderful woman like Dallas Brody and Carolyn Findlay, who's obviously a great politician. I'm talking about most politicians. They're not leaders; they're followers. They're going to stay in that herd because they're like pigs at the trough, right? There's just so much to gain from being in power. They're not going to give it up for, and they don't care where this all leads because they themselves have profited so immensely. Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, said, some people say a small group of committed citizens can't change the world, and yet that's all that ever has. That's it. It's going to take people like you and me, David, and the people who are writing comments on the screen. It's going to take us to say, no, we're not going to accept this. There's going to be an absolute end to the reserve system. There's going to be an end to any special privileges based on race. race in our country. I don't mind if there's a child who's disabled who gets to sit at the front within his wheelchair in a classroom. That makes good sense, but there should never be special privileges in any democracy, in any decent society, based on race or ancestry or who came first or second or last to a land. I think it's just people have to say enough. And with gender, the gender stuff in schools, where you've got kids being told, oh, maybe you're in the wrong body and you should be sterile for the rest of your life and have your body parts removed or changed. And you just have to don't go to the principal or to the superintendent or to the minister of education and say, please put an end to this gender affirming care, or whatever you want to call it in schools. Those are the people who are enforcing it. Don't go above you. You go against them. You go against those people. You just say no. And this is what 1BC is trying to do as a political movement in British Columbia, is just saying, no, British Columbia is for all British Columbians. It's one, everyone's equal. It's 1BC. It's the same for you, me, or anybody else. And that's powerful. And so again, I don't rely on anybody. If I relied on anybody in the educational system to come out and say, oh, by the way, the residential schools, they didn't murder, the priests and nuns didn't murder these kids, I'd be waiting until, I'd be long dead before anyone in the system did that. No, it's run. It's not by cowards. It's by people who have these powerful self-interests. They know the best thing to do is to go along with ideology. During obviously the 1930s, you want to be successful in Germany, you became a national socialist or a communist in 1917 Russia. This is what you do. You become a woke cultist to be successful. And that's been the case for now, certainly in the last decade, but longer. In Canada, no, it's going to take ordinary people like you and me, David, just to say, no, we're not accepting this. I'm not accepting any of it. There's absolutely no special privilege based on race anymore in this country.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I've always maintained, and I've been talking this way for decades. We're attracting some real bots today over this. I expected that, because people hate the truth in this country. Any country where Mark Carney is trusted the way to the degree he is, supposedly, as the polls are suggesting. I read one today that it doesn't matter what you say, but what Mark Carney proposes, it's a good idea because we trust him. And I just find that astronomically incredible, because here's a man who's putting the interests of himself ahead of Canada every step of the way, who is invoking a censorship and surveillance regime that is truly frightening. And anyway, I could go on about that, but you mentioned, of course, Germany in the 1930s and 40s under their leader. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jewish people of their citizenship. They were not allowed to own property, and they could literally be thrown out of apartments if so-called Aryan folk wanted to occupy them. And they could be thrown out of their houses. Houses were usually bought at a pittance of what they were worth, if they got anything at all, because there were, of course, two-tiered system of citizenship. There were non-citizens and citizens. I don't see any difference between that system and what BC has right now. Because if you happen to be of the right ethnic origin, the right racial origin, then you have a special status in that province that other people just don't have and will never have, because they don't fit the racial bill. Most people would look at that system and say, you know what, that's racist, because it's based on race. That's the primary operational area. If you want to define racism, well, it's anything that is obsessed or based primarily on racial privilege. And that, of course, is what exists in BC right now. So why does the left find that so hard to grapple with? Because they can certainly understand other authoritarian systems, other totalitarian systems where race is a factor, but they somehow think this is okay. Is it only because the reconciliation propaganda, and there's no other way to describe it, is so strong that we literally have to give away our backyards to reconcile for things that allegedly happened in the past? But I'll tell you this, Jim, I don't need to reconcile with anybody in this country based on their ethnic origin. I have done nothing to harm anybody, regardless of the color of their skin or their ethnic origin. And I think it's time we stop talking about reconciliation, because if there was ever a need to do that, we have long since passed that point. Don't you? Would you agree?
Yeah, I just one thing that I think fits in is a concrete example, David. Reconciliation. It was just it's a political idea that came down from the top, and it's a game to make the liberals feel as though they've got a purpose. And all, of course, obviously, it's going to do is again, it's the greatest threat in Canadian history. All this giving away people's rights to private property and to public access to parks and soon it'll be roads and soon it'll be all sorts of things, because if you give an Indian a native band control of a large swath of BC and you have to now pay $25 just to step on their property in the form of a visa, that means you're paying $25 just to use the highway that you or your ancestors paid for and to move further. So it's just awful. I just think that something that's fun to mention, and that is, again, just showing about how this isn't going to come about waiting for a politician to make the right legislative changes. And not that's important, and there will be heroic legislators who are going to do that, and I think it's coming. But I think it's ordinary people, and I'll use one thing that I did that I'm proud of recently, and it doesn't seem like much, but it just shows you don't have to do much. Well, one of them I've been posting about is I ran provincially and federally in recent years just so I could walk out of all candidates' meetings when they did the land acknowledgement. So I've been walking out of land acknowledgements for years. I go to places just to walk out in the land acknowledgement. So we do have the power to do that. So I went to a week ago. I went to get my hips checked. I have artificial hips, and then the doctor wants to see me every couple of years to see how they're doing. And so I went in to get x-rays before the visit. And the very first question I was asked was, am I Indigenous? And I said, and it upset me because there's the Peace Arch Hospital in White Rock, British Columbia, where 2 years ago they asked me if I was pregnant, because that was the big thing then about everybody getting blood tests had to, in case you're pregnant, because sometimes blood tests are bad if you're pregnant. And so they're asking, older men like me if I'm pregnant. So this is how crazy these woke administrators are at this hospital and right across the land. So they asked me if I'm Indigenous. And I think there's a really easy answer to that. And I looked at the nice young woman whose family is obviously from India. And she was very sweet with me. And that was her first question. And I looked at her and I said, please do not misinterpret what I'm about to say to you. This has nothing to do with you. But I'm never going to answer a question like that, because you may not know this, but medical care in Canada is universal. That's what it is. It's like our fundamental rights. They do exist. They're written down. They were written down, long ago in the original Constitution Act. They were written down in British law. They just, they come to us from 1215, from the Magna Carta. We've had basic rights for a long time that relate to, as you said earlier, David, about it's meant to be for everybody, not just for the nobles or not just for the king. And I said that I would never answer a question like that, just like I refused to answer the question as to whether I was pregnant a couple of years before. And she looked at me and she gave me a sense that nobody else had done the same thing, that everybody goes in and goes, no, I'm not Indigenous, and therefore I'll be at the back of the lineup for getting x-rays or whatever. I just, there's so many things that people can do in their daily life that just topples this idiocy, because we know fundamentally you don't need Martin Luther King to tell us that you shouldn't judge people by the color of their skin, but by their character. And people know that, and apartheid is wrong, and having a racist system is wrong. Me as a teacher treating a child, people are always saying to me, am I passing my Indigenous kids? Are they doing well? Are they getting extra help? Are you doing this or that for the Indigenous kids? And I always answered, and this goes back 20 years now, I always answered to them in the politest of way. I said, I'm not answering that question. I'm a teacher. My mandate is to serve every child well. And I would never look at a child and discriminate on the basis of anything that child can't do anything about, such as birth characteristics or ancestry. So, and anyhow, so it just takes more Canadians, I think, to just say we're not going to participate in it anymore. Done. No. Parents going to the office and say, "Oh, there's a pride flag in my kid's classroom, or a BLM flag, or there's a, Indigenous this or whatever. I'd like that removed, and I'm not leaving your office until it's removed. I want. You just had to insist and say, no, that you're misunderstanding. You're not here to manipulate children. It goes against the School Act in British Columbia. It goes against the standards, professional standards for educators in the province and right across the country. You cannot take advantage of children politically, socially, financially, sexually. You just can't do that. The pride flag is, some of the stuff in there is just so sexually depraved. And there's nothing about for white people or Asian people. There's no color in that flag for them. There's nothing for heterosexuals. There's nothing for Christians. I mean, if you're going to have a flag in a public school classroom, it should be for every single child in the classroom. So that's the example I wish to set for a number of years now, and for the rest of my life. And people know I'm real because I am again in the Supreme Court, and because I've been fighting all these years. Because I don't bend and not bending everybody against anybody, union, employer, regulatory body, BC Labor Relations Board, anybody come after me, and you got a fight on your hands. If there are more Canadians that would just stop where they are and just say, no, I'm not participating in any of this. I'm Indigenous. I'm just as much Indigenous as anybody else in this classroom, in this courtroom, or anywhere else. I was born here. My parents were born here. Their parents were born here. How dare you deprive me of a sense of having a homeland? What are you doing? No, I don't accept it. So I think that's what's needed. Leaders are important. Good leaders are important, but much more important because there's many more of us than them. And I don't trust political leaders because political leaders are out for themselves. I trust ordinary men and women, people like you, David, who are principled, have convictions, and the courage to stand by them. And if I said to you right now, David, can you just do this little favor for me, and I'll give you money, or I'll help boost your ratings or whatever. If you could just say that the Musqueam should own Vancouver, you wouldn't do it.
No.
And we just need more people who are just saying, remember what their mothers and fathers and grandparents taught them growing up. You do what's right. You don't discriminate against people on the basis of race, for goodness sake.
Well, I was speaking to a fairly high level. How shall I put it? Authority in the BC Conservative Party last week, and he said, "David, stop referring to the Indigenous people as First Nations." He says, because they might not have been first, and they're certainly not nations. But you've raised something that I have to say 100% as well, Jim. Why are we calling them like they're Indigenous, some sort of special class? We're all Indigenous. I was born in British Columbia, in Comox, British Columbia, and that's my home. My father was born in Canada. He was born in Saskatchewan. He was Indigenous too. And my mother was born in Ontario. She was Indigenous too. So why are we creating a special class of race? And I have to say, I left my local Rotary Club because I couldn't stand the land acknowledgements anymore. And I said, I can't stand this anymore. And, well, that's too bad. We're going to keep doing. Well, that's too bad. I'm gone. I can't do this anymore, because I think as long as we do these land acknowledgements by rote everywhere we go, and as I say, it's from the local Rotary Club up to King Charles during the speech from the throne. My jaw dropped when I heard, well, not that I'm a fan of King Charles, but I couldn't believe, reading the speech from the throne, he literally said, Canadians don't own Parliament Hill. It's on land that was never ceded by some group, by two groups. I think one of them was the, I can't even remember the native bands. The
Algonquin.
Yeah, the Algonquin, yes. And I'm thinking, really? I don't own Parliament Hill. Canadians don't own Parliament Hill. The Algonquin Nation owns Parliament Hill. And King Charles is up there making that certain. So should we be amazed that so-called First Nations, so-called indigenous bands are not demanding the world and the universe or the moon, because we've essentially said it's yours already. Because every time we open up any session of just about anything from municipal government upwards, we're telling them, yeah, you really do own this land. And people don't think that has an effect. Oh, it's all so innocent. We can say that just because we're trying to be in the spirit of reconciliation. We're just saying that because we feel so sorry for the alleged wrongs that occurred in the past. Well, let's start thinking about how that's a wrong that's occurring in the present, because the more we say that, the more the cards are stacked against us, and we're going to start losing land because they're going to say, well, aren't you telling us it's unceded? Are you serious or not? Because all of this matters. And I don't think the average Canadian who thinks, like the mayor of Red Deer literally injected a land acknowledgement into a news conference with Premier Daniel Smith and the Prime Minister. It wasn't even on the program, I'm sure, because Smith didn't really want one. But the mayor of Red Deer decides you better have a land acknowledgement. So she reads a land acknowledgement to the crowd. And I'm thinking, what is the consequence of this? We're going down a road to enslavement. And it's like we have nobody to, and I don't include you and I into this, but so many Canadians have nobody to blame but themselves because they played along with this game thinking it was harmless or innocuous. And it's anything but.
It's just incredibly absurd, because you've got police officers and firefighters and so forth that be announcing some murder spree or terrible fire that's devastated a portion of the community, and people are going, well, what happened? And we need to know, and are we safe? And they go, well, but first we need a land acknowledgement. It was innocuous, it seemed, before hockey games, 20 years ago. And it's just absolutely incredible that people are doing it. But David, I think what's happening right now is that there are too many of us that are walking away. And you walked away from the Rotary Club, which is great. And I walked at a land acknowledgement, so I think it's a good thing. But I think there has to be a time when people like you and me and the people who are watching, they just have to not walk away. We have to get the others to walk away. I'm going to go back in the school system. I am actually still in the school system. Nobody knows how I am in the school system, but I'm still teaching. But what I'm doing is I'm making clear to all those who are trying to destroy me. Again, my union, my employer, my regulatory body, the Labor Relations Board, and others. I'm making it very clear to them that I'm not going away, but they're going to go away. That schools, that it's not a case of me getting money or getting my job back. That's not what it's about. It's about them either leaving their jobs or hadn't walked out like they walked me out. That I'm not going anywhere until Canadian schools are no longer judging kids on the basis of the race, where they're no longer like perverts inquiring into the sexual orientation of 12-year-olds in the classroom, where they're no longer telling people that science is less important than some elder who says, oh, there's 25,000 disappeared and missing Indigenous children from residential schools. Oh, really? Oh, okay. And the evidence of that? Well, what's the evidence, for example, the 215 in Kamloops? You said earlier, it's pipes. It's built on an irrigation, on a sewage system. And so I think all this has to end. And again, my message, and I apologize for sounding a bit like a broken record, but I think we have to not be armchair quarterbacks. We have to get out in the field, and we have to say, no, I'm going to make that tackle. I'm going to stop this institution from doing this one thing. And the next act that I'm going to do in the community where I live in Delta is I'm going to, with a group of people, I'm going to go and insist by leading a protest against a plaque that they have outside the City Hall. It says that there are all these children that were discovered at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in Graves, and which of course didn't happen. So again, it's just not enough to write letters, or not enough to say, well, I'm not going to be part of your group anymore. It's going to the group and saying, you're going to change, and just watch.
Yeah, I think you've got a very good point there. And I guess in my in my own defense, I'm anything but activist in terms of getting these opinions out there because I write for 3 publications, including my own on Substack. I talk about this issue all the time on here with folks, and I've had people in the comment section today saying I'm crazy because I defended the Universal Ostrich Farms. They're going back to that. Yeah, and I still defend Universal Ostrich Farms, and I will to my dying day because that was a huge state intrusion. But somebody posted this, and I think this was really I guess the penultimate last question for me was, I think Brody and Finley should team up. It'd be a force to be reckoned with. That's Firecracker007 who posted that. Thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you that because I don't know Carolyn Finley well. I supported her during the leadership because I saw nothing but bad things coming from Carolyn Elliott. I supported her in the leadership. I'm not a member of any political party, provincial or federal. I know Dallas Brody because I've had her on the show several times. I really like what she says, and I think she's a courageous woman. How do you think they should get together? That the parties should get together because, from what the BC Conservatives are telling me, is that they're not worried about the BC Centre Party because it's nothing more than NDP light, and the people voting small C Conservative are not going to vote BC Centre, but they will potentially vote for one BC instead of the BC Conservative. Do you think there should be a united front on the right within Conservatives, Libertarians who want to stop what the NDP is doing? I think something has to happen with a unified, cohesive effort here because, God help us, if the NDP steal another election, I don't see BC surviving. So
I'd be happy to answer that, David, because first of all, I know that that Dallas and Carrie Lynn had dinner together on Friday night, and Dallas posted about that. So they are in talks. I certainly believe there will be a united front. Does that mean there will be only one party? I don't know that, and that's a decision that Dallas Brody will be taking. Her fear, if I may be trying to speak for her, but I think I'm doing it with some justice because I know her well, is that she doesn't want to lose any of her integrity. She doesn't want to lose any of her policy positions. She is completely categorically true gold. She really is saying that British Columbia is for every British Columbian. There's no special status. There's going to be no homeless people on the street. There's going to be no more, drugs being given to our youth. There's going to be no more tolerance for this, that, everything else. Parks are going to be for everybody, not just for the Indigenous. Those are her positions. So what I think the reason 1BC came about, if I am, and I'm in a good position to, as the candidate, the only candidate this time for the party to say this, is because the Conservative Party really failed British Columbians, and I think it's been failing Canadians for a long, long time. Failing much less so than the other parties. I still think it's the best political option, mainstream political option, without a doubt, in Canada. And I have, of course, endless amounts of Conservative friends and people who I admire greatly. But I think political correctness is sort of like a rotting fish. It's a really awful thing. And this is what happened to the Conservative Party. It began to rot because it just worried so much about, what's going to win the next election as opposed to what is really best for the province. And those are two separate things. So the Conservative Party nationally thought that it would be good to stay away from these school issues. So I use school issues, for example, all the race stuff and the gender stuff, and all transitioning kids for the Indigenous stuff, getting rid of standards, bashing Canadian history in the schools or not even teaching it, censoring all the literature. I could go on and on. I should say this one last thing, smearing our ancestors. All these terrible things that are happening in the school system, and the Conservatives provincially and federally weren't even talking about that until very recently. And then Poilievre thinks he's making a courageous stand, saying, "Oh well, women is a woman or whatever." And my gosh, people were saying that years ago. Again, when I was walked out of the classroom almost 5.5 years ago, there was nobody in conservative circles. There was not a single conservative who came to me and said, "Well, Jim, of course there's no dead bodies and there's no nuns with guns and all this sort of stuff. So we're with you." Nobody did that. No, and nobody had the courage. Now, I think Dallas is alone right now and having that courage. I'm hoping and believing that Carrie Lynn Finley will as well. But I think Dallas Brody is not going to give up on 1BC until she knows that her principles, which are really the principles of the vast majority of Canadians, which is everyone should be treated equally and hiring should be done on merit and everybody should be the same, in a classroom or, in a courtroom or whatever, not based on answers. All these just really basic Canadian ideas, which are charter protected or supposedly. If Dallas feels that the Provincial Conservative Party is going to stand by these core national values, then I think it's a no-brainer that she'll join forces. And but this is what a lot of people, what they want to do is they want to put politics above principles, and I don't think that works with Dallas Brody. I think she's unique in this regard, that she's had so much success in life in so many different ways, starting with her years in an Ivy League university and becoming a very successful lawyer and so much else. And she's has a lot of business interests and so forth. She doesn't need to be an MLA to be a success. So she's standing by her principles. And a lot of people say, "Oh, well, we'll put the principles aside. Let's get elected. And then we'll bring back those principles and things are going to be fine." But I don't work that way, because if you work that way, then there's no guarantee those principles will be brought back. And more importantly, you got to wait. And so I could have done that. I could have done what the lawyers said to me when I was walked out of the classroom. I did talk to some lawyers, particularly in the family, my family, and they said, "Oh, don't say anything, just wait. And 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you should win your case." Well, I said to them, "Well, what if I don't win in 5-10 years and nothing happens in that time?" Then they said, "Forget that." And so right away, I just I protested outside my school. The police, carted me away. I not arrested me, but I mean, I've just been everywhere I go. I'm threatened. I'm this, that, and everything else. And then all of a sudden, I wake up and I go, "Hey, there's no more drag queens," as I said earlier, in any school in Canada. There's very little race stuff. There's no more BLM flags. Soon there'll be no more pride flags. There's going to be no more talk about murder at residential schools. On and on and on. And you know what? That's me. That's just me. That's just little old me. I know other people come on and become much more important in these issues than I. But when I was fighting these things all these years ago, it was just me. Now I know they're bigger players and everything, like with the drag queen thing. Obviously, Billboard Chris here in British Columbia, it was far more important than I. But in the school system, I was going, as I said earlier, from parking lot to parking lot at schools, talking to parents and saying, "Do you know what's happening in the classroom?" So the reason I'm saying that, look, I'm a nobody, I'm going to stay nobody, and obviously I'm not going to get any money or my job back. I'm not going to get elected. But what I am doing is I'm helping to make Canada the country that we expect and we want it to be. And all I'm asking, David, is for your viewers to go around and get other people to do this, to not put up with this stuff anymore. We don't need new politicians to tell us how to think. We know how to think already. And what we need to do is insist on anyone who gets elected that we need to hold their feet to the fire and say, "Look, you know what's right and what's wrong. And you're either going to do what's right or you're going to have a problem with it."
Yeah, I agree. And in terms of what you said, in terms of Dallas Brody needing that guarantee, that assurance that any sort of united front would include a commitment to what the Conservative Party of BC is saying right now. Don't start saying, "Well, we're a soft pedal of that because some people might." No. And I guess this is the point I try to make every time I discuss this with anybody. I hope we've reached critical mass over these issues. And if you think Dallas Brody, or if you think Carolyn Findlay is extreme for espousing these views, for wanting the end of Aboriginal title, for wanting the end of UN drip, then I'm sorry, you're delusional. Because that's not extreme, that's normal, that's common sense. And if we've come so far that's somehow extreme to talk about equality under the law and that we all have the same rights, then God help this country and God help the province of British Columbia. But I do think, maybe I'm optimistic, I think we've reached critical mass on this issue. And if we haven't, then it is over. Then it is over. If governments and parties cannot sustain their commitment to stop the madness, then the madness will continue. And so I agree with you 100%. There has to be assurance before anything moves forward. And I think we have to keep fighting. That's what I'm doing on here. It could have been a lot more profitable for me to stay with the mainstream media where I worked for many years, or to be a propagandist for a political party, because they are streamlined on social media. If you want to get on the air every day and just hype a political party and a political leader and say they're perfect, that's the kind of people YouTube loves. and you're fighting against the tide otherwise, but I will always do that. I'm not here to be in anybody's pocket. So I want to ask you, and I've taken up a lot of your time today, Jim, but how are you doing right now in terms of employment? Is it all based on the book? How are you working at all? And can people support you in any way?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. I make very little money on every book because I purposely made it. I just want people to read the book and know my story, so it doesn't happen to other teachers, other employees. So there's really no income there. But I think it's an important thing for people to know. My income, I have a little part-time teaching job, which I can't talk about because they'll go after me and they'll go after school. But I put it out there because they're not going to change me. One of the allegations against me is that I said to them, I have democratic right to speak. I'm not going to be muzzled. I'm not going to, because you want me to give condolences to First Nations over residential schools, when nothing happened to residential schools that was any different than any other school back in time. Obviously, there were fires, accidents, and diseases and so forth, but they were the residential schools. There were people that did their best, and in many cases, they were pretty extraordinary places, and many of the students, recognized it and wrote about that. And some went back and taught at residential schools, and there were unions and so forth. So how do I manage without really any income? Well, I was able to one time put money aside, and I'm going to be fine. But the important thing for me is that I would love people to buy my book and be interested in my story, but I don't want money from anybody. That's an ethical decision that I took long ago. In life, I was going to do it on my own, and if I couldn't do it on my own, then I was going to perish. And I'm not going to be a parasite. I'm going to be a giver. And I think that's how I'm living my life. But what I ask from people is one thing, and that is to care about your country, to care about your family, care about your kids. And you can't do that if you turn a blind eye to what's happening in our schools and happening all around us. And I think you're going to have war in the streets. You're going to have terrible violence like Canada has never experienced before in its history, and even worse than what happened in the rebellions of 1834 long ago in Upper and Lower Canada. If you continue to take away not just private but public land from tax-paying Canadians, so not only does this Indigenous special entitlement need to end, but there should be no benefits in any job or any scholarship or anything for anyone based on race. And if you continue to go down this woke path of pitting one group in society against other groups, then you're going to have no Canada.
I 100% agree with that, and that's the fight ahead of us. And I want to thank you for the courage you've shown and for the dedication you've shown. This is not an easy road, and it could have been an easier one for you, just like for a lot of us who insist on standing for truth. And I know you stand for truth, and You've made a lot of good points here. It's interesting the conversations that were going on in the comments section. I put a fraction of the comments. We got hundreds of comments today about this, and every time we talk about this issue, there's tremendous issue because I think, as you said, this could lead to. I hate to use the word violence on the streets, but it's going to lead to turmoil in society that I don't think we've ever seen in our lifetimes. Because when people tell you, "Well, I'm sorry, you don't own your house anymore, and you don't own your backyard," it's been extorted, it's been expropriated by the band. Or similarly, when a cop comes to your front door and says, "I'm sorry, we're going to arrest you for a social media post you put up, which we think is hateful." And I've already had the cops at my door about not about a hateful post, but a disagreeable one from a year and a half ago because of Bill C9. So God help us, we've got a provincial government in BC that wants to squash rights entirely. We've got a federal government that has taken away free speech. It's a censorship and surveillance government. So we have to keep fighting back, and that's what I say every day to people. If you think for a minute that this isn't serious, that we still live in good old Canada, the democracy, no, we don't. Property rights are evanescent, and freedom of speech is essentially gone. And it's just getting worse. It started under Trudeau, it accelerated under Carney, and that's where we are. So I apologize for keeping you so long this morning. It's been a great
Can I
conversation.
say one last thing?
Last word to you, Jim.
I know it won't be the last one. It'll be very brief. That my father was a good fortune having a father who was the Chief Justice of Ontario, and he was involved in the constitutional talks in 1981 and part of the
Roy
charter.
McMurtry?
Roy McMurtry, yeah.
I remember Roy, yes.
Yeah, so my father and I had lots of chats, and particularly when he was on his deathbed, and he believed, like everything that I've said to you today, these are core values of my father. They, he began someone believing very strongly in Canada, but he didn't understand toward the end of his life how they could take down the statue of Queen, or cut off the head of Queen Victoria, or take down the statue of Sir John Macdonald, or knock down the bust of, or wanting to remove the bust of Winston Churchill. This is, they've removed Macdonald's name really from everywhere, from the law school, from pubs, from everywhere in Kingston, where Macdonald, really did his most important work. It's just my father didn't understand that because he was a true Canadian. He believed in what Canada has always been and strives to be. We're not perfect. We're a project, but we're better than others in so many ways. We've done much more for Indigenous people than any other country in the world, times 10. And yet, look what we're doing. We're self-flagellating, and we're self-accusing, or even accusing ourselves of genocide. So I think you're absolutely right when you said, David, those are prescient words that I think we've reached a critical mass. And you're going to see that in the days, weeks, and years ahead.
Well, Jim, it's been a pleasure. I want to get you on the show again. And we're going to continue to support the work you do. I repost a lot of your material on X. I'll continue to do that. I'm going to continue to promote your book every day. I want people to read it. Even if you're not making a bundle of money off it, I want people to read it, Jim. I think it's important. And if there's anything we can do to be of assistance, my door is always open. And you can communicate with me anytime you want. And let's continue to stay in touch. I think your work is tremendously courageous and tremendously necessary for the country right now. So thank you for spending this hour and a bit with me. It's been a pleasure, a real pleasure. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you so much.
Bye for now, Jim. That was Jim McMurtry, who is a very courageous teacher from British Columbia. Thank you for joining me today. I'm just going to put the merchandise on. I'll be back with some concluding remarks. we will be donating a significant amount of the money raised by these t-shirts. And yeah, you can get them in these wonderful colors. You can get them in gray, blue. I think we got them in pink. Great episode. Thanks for the lively conversation. No thanks to people who call me a hack. I've never been a hack. You know, you can call me what you will, but I'm never a hack. I try to tell the truth. I try to do what is best, not just for me, but for my country. That's why I served my country admirably. Thanks for watching again. And by the way, don't give up. We always say in the station, resolve to resist. Keep coming back. YouTube had its thumb on this broadcast today. They didn't even want the show to start. It took me literally 5 minutes of trying to get the show on the air. That tells you a lot, doesn't it? That tells you just about everything you need to know. This is a man who has been canceled in so many ways, but he's not taking no cancellation for an answer. He's fighting back, and we are too. Keep your thoughts and your prayers on those people in British Columbia who are fighting wildfires right now, who are losing homes, who have animals threatened, have their lives threatened by wildfires, that in no small part are a result of bad provincial policy that is more concerned with climate change than it is with good forestry management. Damn them for that. Keep them in your thoughts and prayers. And our hearts go out right now to Katie and Karen at Universal Ostrich Farms, who are fighting hard for those around them and fighting hard for the animals around them as well as the humans. Thanks for watching today. God bless you, and Godspeed to all you do. Thank you for sharing this station with your friends and family. Thank you for hitting that like button, because I tell you, we are fighting back in a way I've never had to before, because I'm going to keep this station on the air. I'm going to keep fighting for freedom. I'm going to keep fighting for justice and truth. And I am damn determined to resist this Carney government in any way possible as it encroaches upon our individual freedom. And it will continue to do that, mark my words. I'll be back again tomorrow. Same time, same place. 10 a.m. This has been David Krayden, broadcasting live from our nation's capital in Ottawa. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow.